What's up, guys? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next question on the test. We have a function e of t equals negative 3t squared minus 48t plus 900 that models the production expense for a company in thousands of dollars where t represents time in years. Determine the model that describes time in terms of expenses. So notice here we have a function, expenses in terms of time. They want a function that describes time in terms of expenses. So they're asking for the inverse. So they're asking for the inverse of this function here. Now notice this function, it's given as a quadratic, and the quadratic is in standard form. And as you know, to find the inverse of a quadratic, it always has to be in vertex form. Sometimes it'll be given in vertex form, sometimes you're going to have to convert it to vertex form. So unfortunately, in this case, we have to convert this to vertex form. So the way we do that, we complete the square. Take out a negative 3 from these two. So negative 3 factors out, we'll be left with t squared. Negative 48t divided by negative 3 gives us positive 16t. And then the plus 900 we leave outside. Then we'll have e. I'm just going to put e instead of e of t. So e is equal to negative 3 t squared plus 16t. Take half of 16, which is 8, square it, which is 64. So we'll have plus 64 minus 64 plus 900, like that. Now, when we took half of the b value and squared it, we took half of this b value, not half of this one, right? So be careful with that. If you factor something out, you're always taking half of this b value here. So half of 16, 8 squared is 64, not half of 48. Okay, from here, we factor out this negative 64. Take out the negative 64 from the bracket, you got to multiply it by what's in front. Negative 3 times negative 64 gives us positive 192. Then we'll have plus 900 here. And then this here always factors into a simple trinomial. So t squared plus 16t plus 64, that factors into t plus 8 squared. This number is always going to be half of that number, right? And then this sign is always going to be that sign. So if this is minus 16t, this would have been t minus 8 here. And then 192 plus 900, that gives us 1092. Right? So we took this expense function, which was a quadratic in standard form, converted it to vertex form. So now we could find the inverse. So if I take this and then write it up here, so we'll have e equals negative 3 t plus 8 squared plus 1092. We just find the inverse now. Now this part here is a little bit different because this is a word problem versus if this was just a regular quadratic. If you remember with a regular quadratic, like let's say this was just y equals negative 3x plus 8 squared plus 1092. With a regular quadratic, to find the inverse, we switch the x and y, right? So we let x equal negative 3, y plus 8, squared plus 1092, and then we isolate for that y here. But because this is a word problem where these variables actually mean something, so this expense and then this time, we can't just switch the t and the e, right? We can't just say t is equal to negative 3 e plus 8 squared plus 1092. That wouldn't be the right answer. That wouldn't be the right function or the model that describes time in terms of expenses. So with word problems, instead of switching the variables like we do with abstract functions, we just keep them as is, and then we just isolate for what we need. So we have to just isolate for this t here. right? So bring the 1092 over, so e minus 1092 is equal to negative 3t plus 8 squared. Divide both sides by negative 3, so e minus 1092 divided by negative 3 equals t plus 8 squared. Square root both sides, so the square root like that, and then just bring this positive 8 over. So basically t is equal to the square root of e minus 1092 divided by negative 3, and then bring the 8 over, that becomes minus 8. So now notice we have time in terms of expense. So this is the answer. That's what they were looking for. All right, so just remember with word problems, you don't switch the variables. Okay, if these variables actually represent something, in this case expense, time, you can't just switch them, right? You just isolate, you go into isolating for what you're looking for. Versus if this was just an abstract quadratic, right? So y equals negative 3 bracket x plus 8 squared plus 1092, then you switch the x and y, and then you just isolate for y to get that new relation. But in this case, we just isolate for that t, and that is the answer right there.